Also today, U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts delivered remarks at Rice University in Houston with a message about attacks aimed at judges. Justice Roberts told the audience that while criticism of opinions is fair game, he warned against personally directed hostility, and he reiterated that the attacks weren't coming from just one side or political perspective.
Judges around the country work very hard to get it right. And if they don't, their opinions are subject to criticism. But personally directed hostility is dangerous, and it's got to stop.
And Chief Justice Roberts didn't name President Trump specifically, but his comments came after the president said that justices who ruled against his sweeping tariffs were an embarrassment to their families.
Welcome, guys. Adam is here. What just happened, the federal judiciary, from district courts up to the Supreme Court, has converged at the same moment with the same message. Enough. This isn't a series of isolated rulings. It's a coordinated institutional pushback against the broadest executive power grab any president has ever attempted.
This morning, a rare rebuke from Chief Justice John Roberts as President Trump escalates his fight with the judiciary, calling for the impeachment of the judge who tried to block the swift deportation of hundreds of Venezuelan migrants, a directive the judge says the Trump administration ignored. In a statement, Roberts saying for more than 2 centuries it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. Trump responding to the Chief Justice, saying Roberts never mentioned him by name, though it was clear Roberts was responding to the president's statement.
He didn't mention my name in the statement. I just saw it quickly. He didn't mention my name, but many people have called for his impeachment, the impeachment of this judge.
Let me take you inside what is unfolding, because the scope of it is staggering. Chief Justice John Roberts has issued a rare public warning that attacks on judges threaten the entire constitutional system. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 against Trump in the tariff case, with Roberts himself writing that Trump's reading of executive authority would represent a transformative expansion of power the law does not support.
The Supreme Court of the United States has struck down President Trump's ability to use tariffs. IEPA, they said, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. This is a judgment from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. I'm reading through this decision right now, which just came out literally in the last couple of moments here about the president's tariff authority.
Judge Boasberg, the same judge Trump demanded be impeached, found probable cause for contempt over the administration's defiance of deportation orders, warning that willful disobedience makes a solemn mockery of the Constitution. A Reagan-appointed judge named Young wrote a 161-page opinion finding that Trump's government launched a full-throated assault on the First Amendment and that Trump violated his oath to uphold the Constitution.
Reagan-appointed senior judge William Young has a 40-year career presiding over some of the country's highest-profile cases. New reporting from the New York Times takes a look at how the 84-year-old is fast-tracking all the cases against Trump's executive orders that he can, but in a way that, quote, recalls a time when mutual respect and deference to the law were more standard in relations between the executive and judicial branches.
Multiple courts across multiple jurisdictions have used the most extreme constitutional language available to describe the same administration's conduct. Solemn mockery, full-throated assault, violated oath, unconstitutional conspiracy, unbounded authority, transformative expansion. And while all of this is happening, the Trump Justice Department is reportedly compiling a list of egregious judges for possible impeachment. Not for misconduct, not for corruption, for rulings they disagree with. Let me be clear about what that means. The Department of Justice, the very agency responsible for enforcing the law, is using its institutional machinery to target federal judges based on their judicial decisions. This is not a president tweeting his frustration. This is the executive branch deploying its formal resources to threaten the independence of the judiciary. And Chief Justice Roberts, who almost never comments on political controversies, broke his silence to say that this kind of attack threatens the constitutional system itself. Now, before I go further, I need to be precise about one element of this story. The specific claim that 29 judges on an en banc panel unanimously vacated a pro-Trump ruling comes from viral commentary and analysis channels rather than formally verified journalism. That specific case is not confirmed in credible reporting. But here is what is confirmed. The documented judicial accountability pattern is comprehensive and formally verified across multiple courts, multiple jurisdictions, and multiple rulings. And that pattern is so overwhelming that the 29 judges seal his fate framing has become the most accurate dramatic description of what is actually happening. A legal strategy built on delay, on hunting for friendly panels, on claiming immunity at every turn, is colliding with a judiciary that has demonstrated through every significant ruling that those strategies have run their course. Let me give you the full context for why the DOJ compiling a list of judges for possible impeachment is so specifically consequential. Federal judicial independence is the most fundamental institutional protection for constitutional accountability. It ensures that judges can make decisions based on the law, not on fear of executive branch retaliation. An administration that compiles lists of judges for possible impeachment based on their rulings is deploying the most extreme executive branch threat against the most fundamental judicial independence protection. It is communicating that judicial decisions will be met with executive accountability rather than constitutional appellate challenge. This is not a legal strategy. It is an attack on the structure of government itself. Roberts' warning that attacks on judges threaten the constitutional system is the Supreme Court Chief Justice's most public statement directly responding to the most dramatic executive threat against judicial independence. The fact that Roberts felt compelled to speak at all, to break from the tradition of judicial restraint, is the most precise measure of how severely the DOJ's egregious judges dimension has alarmed the most senior member of the federal judiciary. Now, let me break this down into its component dimensions, because each piece of this judicial accountability pattern tells us something specific about how the walls are closing in on Trump from every direction. First, the multi-court constitutional language accumulation. When a single court uses extreme constitutional language, it can be dismissed as one judge's opinion. But when multiple courts across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously use language like solemn mockery of the Constitution, full-throated assault on the First Amendment, violated his oath, unconstitutional conspiracy, and unbounded authority, something else is happening. That is not a series of isolated judicial outbursts. That is a broad judicial consensus forming across the most diverse jurisdictions, from the most diverse judicial backgrounds, all saying the same thing at the same time. Boasberg in Washington saying willful disobedience makes a solemn mockery of the Constitution. Reagan-appointed Judge Young in Massachusetts saying the administration launched a full-throated assault on the First Amendment and that Trump violated his oath. Multiple courts in the deportation cases describing unconstitutional conspiracy. Roberts in the tariff ruling writing about unbounded authority and a transformative expansion of power the law does not support. Together, these rulings most specifically describe the most broadly available judicial consensus that the most fundamental constitutional concerns are the most accurate characterizations of the administration's conduct across every constitutional dimension simultaneously. That broad judicial consensus is what the running out characterization most accurately captures. Not the friendly panel hunting producing accommodating rulings, but the most broadly available judicial consensus most specifically and most publicly documenting the most fundamental constitutional concerns in the most formally available permanent judicial record from the most credible nonpartisan institutional sources across every jurisdiction at once. Second, the Roberts rebuke and Chief Justice warning. Roberts issuing a public statement about the Boasberg impeachment demand is the most unusual Supreme Court conduct. The Chief Justice most specifically broke from the tradition of judicial restraint about ongoing political controversies to most publicly characterize the executive action as the most constitutionally unsuitable response to a judicial ruling disagreement. That tradition-breaking character is the most precise measure of how severely the Boasberg impeachment demand alarmed the most senior member of the federal judiciary. And the warning that attacks on judges threaten the constitutional system goes beyond the immediate Boasberg-specific rebuke. It establishes that executive attacks on judges are fundamental threats to the entire constitutional system, not individual personnel disputes about specific judicial decisions. That constitutional system threat characterization from the most senior member of the federal judiciary is the most consequential institutional statement about the most fundamental constitutional concern, placed in the most public format from the most credible institutional source. Third, the DOJ egregious judges list. The Trump administration compiling a list of federal judges for possible impeachment is the most escalated executive action in this entire story. A president who attacks specific judges on social media is deploying personal rhetoric. A DOJ that compiles lists of egregious judges for possible impeachment is deploying the formal institutional machinery of the executive branch toward a systematic judicial independence threat. That institutional deployment character most directly validates Roberts' constitutional system threat warning because it confirms that the judicial independence threat is systematic institutional executive action, not individual rhetorical excess. The distinction is crucial. Social media attacks, however dramatic, operate through a rhetorical platform without formal institutional resources being systematically deployed. DOJ compiling lists most specifically deploys the formal institutional executive resources, the organized bureaucratic process, toward the most systematic judicial independence threat. That is why Roberts felt compelled to speak. That is why the constitutional system threat warning was issued. Now, let me bring this all together with 4 concrete points that should leave you with a complete understanding of what this story means and what we need to watch as it develops. The multi-court simultaneous accumulation of solemn mockery, full-throated assault, violated oath, unconstitutional conspiracy, and unbounded authority from multiple courts across multiple jurisdictions is the single most consequential judicial consensus expression. Because the multi-court simultaneous character most directly and permanently establishes the broad judicial consensus that the most extreme constitutional language is the most accurate characterization. An individually dramatic ruling, however extreme, can be dismissed as one judge's unusual expression. But Boasberg's solemn mockery in Washington, Young's full-throated assault and violated oath in Massachusetts, the unconstitutional conspiracy findings in deportation courts, and Roberts' unbounded authority in the tariff ruling together establish that the most extreme constitutional language is emerging from the most diverse judicial contexts simultaneously. That diversity and simultaneity is what the "seal his fate" framing most accurately captures. The broad judicial consensus most specifically and most publicly sealing the most fundamental constitutional characterizations in the permanent official record. Roberts publicly rebuking the Boasberg impeachment demand and warning that judicial attacks threaten the constitutional system is the most credible institutional statement in this story. Because the tradition-breaking character of the most senior member of the federal judiciary most publicly characterizing executive action as constitutionally unsuitable, most directly establishes the most urgent judicial independence alarm from the most credible non-partisan institutional source. A justice who routinely comments on political controversies loses the special weight that attaches to extraordinary departures from judicial restraint. Roberts most specifically breaking from that restraint tradition to rebuke the Boasberg demand and warn about constitutional system threats signals that the fundamental concern is urgent rather than routine. That extraordinary departure signaling urgency is why Roberts' statements are so consequential for the overall trajectory. The DOJ compiling a list of egregious judges for possible impeachment is the most alarming institutional escalation in this story, because it most dramatically deploys the formal institutional executive machinery toward the most systematic judicial independence threat, whose formal character most directly validates Roberts' constitutional system threat warning as the most urgent institutional response. Social media attacks on judges operate through a rhetorical platform without formal institutional resources being systematically deployed. DOJ compiling lists most specifically deploys the formal institutional executive resources, the organized bureaucratic process, toward the most systematic judicial independence threat. That institutional deployment character most directly validates Roberts' warning because it confirms that the judicial independence threat is systematic institutional executive action. Here is what we need to watch as this story continues to develop. The DOJ egregious judges list consequence. Whether any judge named on the list becomes the subject of formal congressional impeachment action will determine whether the executive-judicial confrontation crosses from threat stage to formal action stage, whose constitutional consequences would be the most dramatic separation of powers test in modern American history. The Roberts warning legislative response. Whether any congressional members introduce formal resolutions condemning judicial attacks, strengthening judicial independence protections, or taking other accountability actions in response to the Chief Justice's constitutional system, warning will determine whether the most credible institutional alarm produces legislative accountability. The contempt escalation trajectory. Whether Boasberg's probable cause contempt finding advances to named official sanctions will determine whether accumulated judicial accountability reaches its physical enforcement dimension. And the accumulated ruling impeachment integration. Whether the articles of impeachment being developed incorporate the multi-court constitutional language rulings as formal judicial authentication of impeachable conduct will determine whether judicial accountability feeds congressional constitutional accountability proceedings. The bottom line is this: the documented judicial accountability pattern is comprehensive and formally verified. The Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling against unbounded tariff authority, Roberts' public rebuke of the Boasberg impeachment demand, Boasberg's finding that willful disobedience makes a solemn mockery of the Constitution, Reagan-appointed Judge Young's 161-page opinion finding a full-throated assault on the First Amendment and a violated oath, multiple deportation courts finding unconstitutional conspiracy. Together, these rulings describe a broad, multi-court constitutional language consensus whose accumulated simultaneous character establishes the most formal judicial seal on the most fundamental constitutional characterizations. The DOJ compiling a list of egregious judges, most specifically, escalated the executive-judicial confrontation from individual rhetoric to formal institutional executive action, most directly justifying Roberts' constitutional system threat warning as the most urgent Chief Justice institutional response. The step-down imminent framing is the most accurate description of the consequential political and constitutional pressure trajectory whose specific trigger conditions, the midterm electoral outcome, the contempt escalation, the legislative response to judicial independence attacks are the most identifiable pending developments most directly determining whether the accumulated judicial accountability pattern most specifically and most permanently builds toward its most consequential constitutional endpoint.